So since we relaunched the Sociological Review Annual Lecture Series in 2022, we have been dedicated to celebrating global feminist scholarship. This commitment aligns with our editorial strategy in terms of internationalization and EDI. As we actively work on developing our agenda on internationalization and EDI, we also are aware of the complexity underpinning these endeavors. Consequently, the Sociological Review will persist its role as an intellectual platform, fostering ongoing critical reflections and offering insights into the doing of internationalization and EDI. It is with great pleasure in introducing our speaker for tonight, Professor Srila Roy and Professor Maria Dumas Pereira. Srila was at the University of Witwatersrand. Her latest book are Changing the Subject. It was the winner of the Distinguished Book Award of the Sexuality section of the ASA and the Best Book Award of the FTGS section of the ISA. And she was also the recipient of the inaugural FTGS Global South Feminist Scholarship Award. And she's the co-editor of the Journal of Feminist Theory and associate editor of Sociology Compass. Our discussant tonight is Professor Maria Dumas Pereira. Maria was at the University of Warwick, Sociology Department. Maria is also a multi-award winner for outstanding scholarships in sociology of gender and sexuality. In 2027, Maria was awarded the Philip Leverhulme Prize in recognition of her achievement as an outstanding researcher whose work has already attracted international attention and whose future career is exceptionally promising. And in 2018, she received the Feminist Study Association Prize for Best Book of the Year. The topic for this year's annual lecture is Dissonant Intimacies, Decolonizing Higher Education in the Global South. With Srila and Maria, we are going to reflect on how global South academic interactions are underpinned by the complex and uneven scholarships and how they reflect the hierarchies and inequalities that run through the global knowledge production and develop a more nuanced understanding of the discourses of internationalization and decolonization. So tonight, Srila will give her talk, followed by Maria's discussion, and we will have time for the audience to ask questions and to engage with the conversation after their talk. So with no further delay, please join me in welcoming Srila and Maria, who will guide us through this insightful exploration. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wes, for that lovely introduction. Obviously, I'd like to thank the Sociological Review for making this possible. For those of you who don't know, and you probably don't, they've been working tirelessly for, I think, the beginning of the year, and there's so much labor, so much careful thought that has gone into making this possible, making it possible for me to come. But I just want to say especially thought has gone into what it means to bring someone from a country which has a very rubbish currency at the moment. So I'm just really grateful that, all the logistics were taken care of really smoothly, all the reimbursements. And I know that sounds quite small, but it's actually just really significant and thoughtful. So just to name a few people who I've been interacting with, Wes, obviously, Kirsten, who was the first person who invited me, Danielle, you've just been amazing, I've told you several times, Karen Shook, and of course Karen, who I also did the ECR workshop with today, who I can't quite see, but there's a bit of a glare. And thank you to everyone who came today for the ECR session, that was a lot of fun. And of course to everyone who's here. I know it's kind of tricky with trains and public transport, so thank you for being here. And last but not the least, thank you to Maria for accepting the invitation to be a discussant. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. Thank you. I just want to say before we start that I'd also like to acknowledge that this lecture is being delivered at a moment when the destructive workings of colonial power are especially visible in Palestine. And one of the things that the situation brings to the fore is the absolute urgency with which we have to take conversations around the meaning of decolonization, and to understand that, the stakes are pretty high indeed. Okay, I just have a few slides, and let's hope this works. Okay, so when I first moved to South Africa from the UK, I was at times referred to as an Indian from India, to distinguish me from Indians who had lived in South Africa for several generations. I was also a South Asian studies scholar in a South African university, which was possibly rarer than being a new migrant. Most of my colleagues were Africanists, if not working exclusively on South Africa. This was true of higher education in India too, where I was born and grew up. In contrast to both South Africa and India, in the UK, where I previously studied and taught, there were scholars who researched their own and the societies of others. In my own discipline of sociology, white scholars studied Britain and natives like me, their native society or culture. It was upon my arrival in South African academia that I felt, ironically, the burden of identity and place. During a probation and promotion meeting, a senior manager asked me when I would research South Africa. It was also the case that scholars who could not demonstrate how their research spoke to the advancement of a national public did poorly on local metrics of performance and success. At the same time, there were challenges being posed to area studies thinking from within, and a scholarly appetite for comparative study. When I first joined Wits University in 2014, there were new books on how India and South Africa together shaped the Global South, and new institutional initiatives such as the Center for Indian Studies in South Africa, and that's the logo there. And that's an article, a short blog post I wrote on being Indian from India and South Africa, which is appeared on the Cultural Anthropology blog. So by taking advantage of such interest and resources, and of course a way of securing my own tenure and belonging, I enthusiastically developed a feminist scholarly agenda across India and South Africa. More than an Indian from India, I like to think of myself as a transnational feminist. After all, I had cut my intellectual teeth on those like Chandra Mohanty, Jackie Alexander, and Gayatri Spivak, who had revealed the silencing of colonial women at the hands of imperial feminists and the promise of transnational feminist solidarity. Committed to thinking of power relations and of resistance as not confined to nations or borders, the pursuit of transnational study, especially in locales connected through historical and transnational flows, came easily to me. So under the rubric of transnational feminism, I led collaborative research projects and prioritized Southern conversations. I threw myself into the pursuit of what I considered the building of epistemic infrastructures in and across the Global South. Such an agenda proved attractive to external funders, both local and international. At the local scale, new funding regimes had emerged thanks to the geopolitics of BRICS. Internationally, and especially after the South African student movements that I'm going to talk about in a moment, there was a push to decolonize by disinvesting from northern theories and promoting, amongst other things, theory making from the South. The promise of Southern feminist theory also had its uses and values in the neoliberal academy. In practice, however, I found the doing of transnational feminism to be a difficult, even fraught affair. The Global South emerged less amenable to comparison and commensurability than as a terrain of dissonant intimacies. I developed this term from Keguru Macharia, who speaks of the uses and failures of blackness to create a shared ground. For instance, it proved difficult to teach the South in the South, to orient Indian scholars towards African scholarship, and to internationalize Southern and intersectional feminist knowledge from the South. Comparing India and South Africa also produced less conceptual commonality or even clarity than it did difference and difficulty. The decolonial turn also had the inadvertent effect of flattening categories like the Global South and romanticizing Southern solidarity. This made it harder to name the frictions, asymmetries, incommensurabilities, and differences that exist within the South. This is the subject of this lecture and of my forthcoming book of the same name, Dissonant Intimacies. The book develops a framework on decolonizing higher education from a Global South perspective. I draw on my decade-long experience as a South Asian studies scholar in a South African university to reflect on both the necessity and complications of building new epistemic infrastructures, orientations, and habits in and towards the South. As I will argue, Global South academic interactions are underpinned by complex and uneven relationships, the dissonant intimacies to which I refer, which reflect the hierarchies, inequalities, and asymmetries that run through global knowledge production. The hegemony of Western academic structures the dispositions and aspirations, the epistemic habits of institutions and individual researchers located differently and unevenly in the Global South. For Southern scholars in what Maria has called peripheral areas of research, like gender and sexuality, it also makes it harder to opt out of an unequal global epistemic order. In sum, the materialization of transnational and decolonizing imperatives tends to be more difficult and demanding than we assume. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about a feminist collaborative research project that sought to overcome the limits of North-South epistemic and material hierarchies. It seemed primed to fulfill the liberatory promises of the South-South, but in fact failed to do so. On the contrary, it powerfully revealed the coloniality of knowledge and power in higher education and how it manifests differently in separate locales. The partnership constituted less of a shared ground than one of complex and uneven relationships. And this is an argument that was fleshed out in an article published early this year in the Sociological Review. What I've tried to do on some of the slides, most of them, is also put up references that I hope will be of interest, particularly to this audience who may know some of the literature on decolonizing from here, but maybe not from South Africa. So thanks largely to student mobilizations across university campuses, the call to decolonize higher education has become an urgent and familiar one. In South Africa, the Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall movements of 2015-2016 made clear that universities have to change materially as well as epistemically, thereby attaching calls for greater access to higher education to ones for epistemic justice. Their demands and struggles across South African university campuses made additionally clear only the obvious, that the end of colonization, decolonization as a political event, did not mean the end of colonial modes of knowing or being. And as some of you probably know, the lineage of this point can be traced to Latin American decolonial theorists like Mignolo, Quijano, and Maldonado Torres, amongst others. Fallers, as they came to be known locally and globally, exposed the workings of the colonial university before moving beyond the university to call into account the ANC state. Within the university, they demanded a decolonized curriculum, the removal of colonial iconography and symbols on campus, and better representation of Black students and staff. Alongside the demand to stop fee increases and eventually to remove fees altogether, they aligned with precarious service workers in their long-standing demand to be insourced, so to be directly employed by the university rather than precariously so. Black consciousness, Pan-Africanism, and Black feminism or intersectionality comprise their ideological ground. And I have written elsewhere on how intersectionality enabled a formidable critique of the gender and sexual politics of these movements from within. Fallism emerged a powerful epistemology and practice of decolonization. indeed a transnational movement and traveling theory in its own right. It traveled from the south to the north, most prominently as Rhodes Must Fall, #Rhodes Must Fall Oxford, with spectacular effects. The removal of a statue of a slave owner at the Bristol Harbor during the Black Lives Matter protests being just one example. Fallism also traveled within the South in ways that are less recognized. Indian students, for instance, took up the hashtag to protest against fees hikes, but also to reveal the Indian state as a colonizing power. To be sure, these movements failed, at least in their primary goal of ensuring free decolonial higher education for all. Beyond South Africa, the decolonizing imperative in higher education is already considered the source of many unfortunate consequences, not least given its amenability to agendas of diversity in the neoliberal university. The co-option of decolonial agendas can also happen at the hands of elite Southern intellectuals. Kusikani, for instance, accuses Mignolo of building what she calls a small empire within an empire. And critiquing the decolonial bandwagon more generally, Musavi identifies tendencies towards nativism and tokenism, such as the blanket valorization of Southern concepts and knowledges simply because they're from the South, and a corresponding call to reject Western scholarship simply because of its origins. What he calls nativist decolonization can also promote nationalism and populist political agendas in the name of decolonization. Musavi's warnings has played out in South Africa. In the aftermath of the Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall movements, students and academics in South African institutions have witnessed a mainstreaming of a decolonial agenda. These shows the familiar co-option and domestication of a radical idea precisely in its accommodation and mainstreaming. Even in the course of these movements, a narrowing of ideas of Black identity and consciousness was visible, notwithstanding attempts to expand the definition and meaning of Blackness. In more recent times, higher education institutions have tended to reduce the decolonization of knowledge to its Africanization in ways that threaten to parochialize curriculum content. Achille Membe, who's my colleague at WITS, reminds us how, for Fanon, the decolonization as Africanization paradigm was what he most feared in the aftermath of national liberation. And here I quote Membe, who says he is its most trenchant critic because of his conviction that very often, especially when the wrong social class is in charge, there is a shortcut from nationalism to chauvinism and finally to racism. Xenophobic and especially Afrophobic rhetoric informs the direction of established and emergent political parties in South Africa today. It materializes in everyday attacks against fellow Africans, the bulk of whom are poor and precarious workers. Partly in response to the student movement, universities have also hardened agendas of diversity, or transformation as we call it, in ways that feed into wider anti-foreign sentiments when it comes to scholarships and jobs. International staff, even if Black or of color, do not count towards equity goals. South African institutions could thus end up hiring a white South African over a Black African, and there's increased pressure from the Department of Labor to hire only Black South Africans. These are merely some of the peculiar paradoxes that have emerged in the name of decolonizing higher education in this context. One of the ways of countering the co-option and neutralization of decolonial imperatives can be found in Kusikani's recommendation to, I quote, construct South-South links that will allow us to break the baseless pyramids of the politics and academies of the North, and that will enable us to make our own science in dialogue among ourselves and with the sciences from our neighboring countries by affirming our bonds with theoretical currents of Asia and Africa. That is, to confront the hegemonic projects of the North with the renewed strength of our ancestral convictions, end quote. The South-South collaboration that constitutes the grounds for my reflections could well be considered as fulfilling her directive to build something different, something radical or emancipatory among ourselves. In supporting and connecting feminist academics in southern locales, it foregrounded inclusion and belonging for those marginalized by northern institutions, but also ironically less visible to each other. Ultimately, however, its failures force a more difficult and demanding take on decolonizing, one that complicates assumptions that the South-South will, in fact, break the baseless pyramids of the politics and academies of the North. To put it differently, the South-South constitutes no silver bullet. Research collaborations between Northern academics and Southern collaborators have often been experienced by the latter as being extractive and unequal, and centering what Grace Musila, also my colleague at WITS, calls Northern conceptions of what scholarship looks like. Set against such tensions, it would seem that a reorientation of economic and epistemic resources and intellectual energy from the North-South towards the South-South would act as a necessary corrective. So if North-South links are doomed to failure, then South-South collaborations are primed for success. Such anticipatory narratives of success can obscure much. Above all, as I will focus on, they can mask the coloniality of power at work in non-Western academic settings that are themselves highly distinct and differentiated. Funded by a major US philanthropic foundation, the research project that I was principal investigator of over 2019 and to 2022 at WITS was intended to support a new generation of scholarship and scholars on gender and sexuality across Southern Africa and India, Southern and Eastern Africa and India. While it was funded by the North, as is typically the case, the funder hardly called the shots. And the project very intentionally created spaces with solely Southern voices, whether that was staff, student, or other collaborators. Conceptually, the project was interested in feminist theory making from the South, in a clear move against historical divisions of epistemic labor, where the South provides the raw data for metropolitan theorizing in the North. Given the vast difference, as Raven Connell puts it, in the scale of resources available for scholarship, peripheral areas of research like gender and sexuality are poorly institutionalized. In the longer published version, I use Maria's work to argue how it is harder for Southern scholars in women and gender studies to opt out of global academic hierarchies. On the contrary, what she calls the epistemic status, or what she theorizes as the specific epistemic status of women and gender studies, means that the modern foreign plays a key role in strengthening the field's claims and legitimacy locally, even as it reproduces the hegemony of Anglo-American feminist theory and limits the flourishing of local knowledge. I think I find Maria's arguments particularly productive because they talk not just of compulsion, but also the strategic choices that scholars in peripheral areas of research have to make at the periphery. To go back to my collaborative project, the project was multi-institutional and multi-locational and uniquely structured. It acted almost like a mini grant-giving body that supported staff and student research in the main institution and the partner institutions. The principal partners on the project were located in India and Uganda. One was a Gender and Sexuality Studies Center in a relatively new private liberal arts college in urban India. The other was an institutionally older school of women and gender studies in Uganda, which also included a teaching component. With both, however, the collaboration failed to provide meaningful and reciprocal intellectual exchange. Both partners echoed deeply rooted epistemic dispositions or habits that were not reducible to individual personalities or institutional pressures, but spoke of colonial logics and neoliberal demands. These were the conditions that produced a terrain of complex and uneven relationships a terrain of dissonant intimacies amongst feminist collaborators, both located in the South. Sorry, I'm just going to grab the mic. Sure. Okay, so the first 2 years of the project were difficult, compounded by a change of PIs, principal investigators, and of course the pandemic. By then, it was quite obvious that the African partners on the project were not very responsive to its intellectual remit. Preliminary conversations with the partners, but especially, and much later, the partners' public website suggested that the bulk of research, whether being undertaken individually or collaboratively, and whether funded externally or internally, was of a highly applied nature around familiar themes like health, population, economic development, and also spoke to the goals of national transformation. The teaching program of the department offered undergraduate and graduate courses and trainings and diplomas in gender and development envisioned as capacitating local government, various ministries, and community development leaders. It was not surprising that much of the funded research that was being undertaken was around HIV/AIDS and later COVID-19. These large-scale, multiplayer projects would obviously provide greater and more lasting forms of capital and resources than what might have been offered by a relatively smaller scale and primarily scholarly-oriented humanities project. I should also stress that as a smaller scale humanities project, which was also interested in feminist theory making from the South, we were quite wary of funding the usual areas of research such as health and development. But I can talk a little bit more about what we did fund even though in those areas, but try to make it more oriented towards sexuality, which is not as researched in the African context as opposed to gender. We also interacted with researchers in gender and sexuality in Mozambique, who similarly had little time to give our project, given the demands on their labor and time from donor-driven projects and paid consultancies. African feminists like Amina Mama, Desiree Lewis, and Sylvia Tamale, to mention just a few, have shown how a pervasive developmentalism enabled by conservative post-colonial states and neoliberal market reforms has severely limited the development of what they consider to be a critical feminist perspective in many places on the African continent. And even as such kinds of critically oriented feminists have offered alternative and radical epistemologies of gender, Lewis shows the persistence of, and I quote, conservative traditions that obstruct progress in African gender research and advocacy. Many of the public-facing events of this East African Women's Studies department were, in fact, a test case of some of Lewis's more critical observations, suggestive of epistemological trends that are highly applied, empirical and positivist on the one hand, or culturalist and nativist on the other. Lewis, in fact, explains in quite a lot of detail the influence of colonial anthropological imagination on gender research, with its quite relentless focus on African difference and culture, and the ways in which that has established ahistorical and unchanging divides between the West and Africa, and also downplayed structural inequalities between men and women in African communities. In particular, the East African Women's Studies department revealed the enduring impact of both these trends that she points to, anthropology and economic development, in shaping scholarly and public discourse on gender and sexuality. In the published version of the article, I explain how the very origins of women's studies, very similar to the history of women, the institutionalization of women's studies in public universities in India, can be traced to the entangled logics of state developmentalism, women's movement organizing, and the compulsions to rely on bilateral development aid, especially with structural adjustment from the 1990s. The contrast with our Indian partner could not be starker. I can say more about this in the discussion, but just to say, our Indian partner was a private and not a public institution, which makes quite a lot of difference on this terrain. The center we partnered with, it was a research center, had a clear intellectual bent towards sexuality as opposed to gender, framed through North American queer theory. Again, this focus on sexuality is quite unique in comparison to the tradition of women's studies in India, which has tended to focus on woman as a stable category. The events and activities of our partner institution operated with a deep orientation towards the US, reinstating the latter's status as the site and center of knowledge production around sexuality and queerness. For instance, an extension of their flagship speaker series, which was hosted online during the pandemic, featured scholars from North American universities, white and Indian, in conversation with a scholar based in India. The series featured, perhaps for the first time in Indian higher education, celebrity queer theorists, Judith Butler, Jack Haberstam, and Lee Edelman. All speakers evoked categories and critical frameworks familiar to those who traffic regularly and perform US queer theory. The series thus assumed a public who was familiar with the terms of engagement on offer, a public for whom the North, US, and whiteness was the default frame of reference when it came to theorizing queerness. African feminists and queer scholars were not invited to speak at these events or future ones, even as this was taking place during our collaboration with them, and obviously we invited them to collaborate with us. It seemed that it was far easier for these Indian scholars to reach for a Judith Butler, Lee Edelman, and Jack Haberstam than it was for them to reach for a Setu Matabeni, a Stella Nyanzi, a Pumla Kola, a Sylvia Tamale, or even Keguru Macharya. Suggesting how these very names make his thinking, I quote, illegible and uninteresting to mainstream queer studies in the US, Macharya draws attention to academic cultures in which blackness is an afterthought. In the slide, I also have the cover of Macharya's book, Frottage, which I highly recommend. Our partners had the resources and even access through my project, but perhaps not the desire to shape conversations and publics differently. But again, to return to Maria's argument, given the fringe status of certain discipline, like queer studies, scholars located in India may have ambivalent or contradictory desires, or even desires that they fail to realize. Notwithstanding these causes, or whatever the causes may be, these were the grounds for sustaining an intellectual monoculture and of being less hospitable to intellectual traditions from elsewhere. Some Indian scholars are posing alternatives to colonial epistemology precisely by thinking across traditions. They make clear that they are not rejecting Western theory or Western northern located scholars in a dangerous and defensive nativism that has become key to the Hindu rights appropriation of decolonial thought. Rather, they insist on treating the West as one amongst many sources of thinking about the non-West, and thus undermining its universality. The point, I think, is thus not whether to engage the Western canon or its scholars or not, but to aspire towards an intellectual capaciousness that must necessarily interrogate the parameters of epistemic inclusion. Finally, and again in ways that surprised me, the Ugandan and Indian partners seemed to have little to say to one another. They were not very interested in interacting or collaborating with each other. In writing about the limits of Ugandan feminist scholarship, Aneet Hundal shows how, unlike a more intersectional South African feminist tradition, this East African one reproduces nativist nationalist tendencies, or what she calls post-colonial patriarchal nativism, a version of methodological nationalism, which, as you know, is the assumption that social scientific inquiry is contained within national borders. Hundel's arguments undermine notions of a stable and singular feminist Africa, as well as easy investments in Afro-Asian solidarities. Ultimately, then, the asymmetries amongst the institutional players on the project and internally within institutions themselves, and I show in the longer piece how these institutions were not at all uniform spaces, played out in recognizably colonial ways, stabilizing a global division of knowledge production in which theory making is the custodian of the North, for which raw data is provided by the South. In this global supply chain, actors were differently, unevenly, and unequally positioned. Some provided in ways that Southern locales have always meant to raw data for feeding a Northern developmental apparatus, while others transformed data into globally legible theory. Our Indian partners' collaboration with a South African university might have brought it capital and resources, but not legitimacy or status. In contrast, our African partner was less inclined to break away from the development servicing, as Amina Mama puts it, that many African feminists have been shoehorned into doing as a way of sustaining their activities and ensuring their relevance. They thus met Northern needs in other historically enduring and contextually specific ways. But let us be clear that in its own ambitions to produce theory from the South, my project also participated in a shared dynamic of consolidating global knowledge, asymmetries, and the coloniality of global epistemic value chains. The failures of this collaboration to provide meaningful and reciprocal intellectual exchange are, of course, my own. My collaborators will no doubt have their own experiences and explanations for it. Research collaborations tend to emerge out of and align closely with the temporalities and demands of the neoliberal university. They have little time and space to develop organically or to come into their own. Our choices of partners were partly rooted in convenience. A private university in India was easier to partner with than a public one, while an existing memorandum of understanding and prior collaborations with the Ugandan institution made it an obvious choice. My own location on this project as principal investigator was also a convenient one. As an Indian passport holder living and working in South Africa with considerable northern links and connections, I was an ideal native to lead the project. I also operated with my own desires. At a time of rising calls to decolonize the university and undo its colonial imperial lineages, post-colonial and transnational feminist legacies seemed more relevant to me than ever. And of all the distant components of the project, whether funding students, doing events, or partnerships, I was most invested in African and South Asian knowledge and political intimacies. But this led me to anticipate sameness, to underestimate difference and inequality, and ultimately to consider certain things to be failures and others to be a success. So what I read as failure, the lack of reciprocity, solidarity, exchange, reveals much about my own desires, but also about wider investments in the South-South as being intrinsically positive, even liberatory, given its status as remedy to Northern epistemic hegemony. These desires can elide, even obscure, the frictions and hierarchies that exist within the South. They also mask certain obvious truths. We know, for instance, that Southern theorists are not always in conversation with each other. On the contrary, the coloniality of knowledge means that they will engage in decolonial theory from the North than elsewhere in the South. We also know that without material redistribution, a change in funding streams for feminist scholarship, for instance, decolonization is a mere metaphor. Finally, we know that rubrics like the North-South or the West-Non-West can end up flattening the complexities of academic work in unequal geopolitical conditions, even in one and the same setting, given their tendency to traffic in homogenizations and generalizations. My institutional home in South Africa can be described as the North and the South. but internally uneven, as many of these institutions are. We have academics who are trained in the North, who speak in globally legible academic languages, and colleagues whose epistemic dispositions are oriented far more locally than globally. Institutional politics and practices tend to reward northern-facing academics and research in matters of probation and promotion. Compared to our partners, my home institution was obviously in a much stronger position, holding the purse strings of a generous northern grant, which afforded me as PI certain forms of advantage and power. It meant that I could curate public events with Southern speakers alone, while choosing to publish in northern channels like the Sociological Review. As a recognition of these contradictions and inequalities, I made minimal demands around publications when it came to project partners, but still acted transactionally in expecting Southern scholars to be in conversation with one another. Against easy celebrations then of Southern exchange and romanticized views of Afro-Asian feminist solidarity, the South-South emerged a terrain of dissonant intimacies, which was not merely infused with nativist and nationalist biases, but also with forms of coloniality. The absence of Western institutions and players did not amount to anything straightforwardly decolonial in practice. On the contrary, the asymmetries amongst the institutional players on the project and internally within the institutions themselves played out in recognizably colonial ways. There are constraints and gains to these dynamics, as well as the desire, fulfilled or not, to shift them. In conclusion, let me ask, what might be an alternative to top-down imperatives to decolonize through the South-South? Social movements have comprised one organic site of decolonizing and transnationalism. As Mahvesh Ahmed has recently said, decolonial, and I quote, decolonial theorists from outside disciplinary sociology have been more insistent on centering the worlds of colonized subjects and the knowledge of their movements. Perhaps that is why student movements, more than institutional academics, were central to placing decolonization at the center of university agendas. Indeed, the transformations that took place, at least in South African higher education, would not have happened without the violent rupture wrought by student activists. When I joined WITS just before these movements broke, US-based scholars from decolonial theorists like Mignolo and Maldonado Torres to feminists like Butler were regular presences on campus. In the afterlife of these movements, African scholars became more visible on the same platforms. This was merely one way of recognizing the epistemic status of African knowledge and of responding to student demands for greater and more radical forms of hospitality, such that the African student might say of the university, and I quote again from Membe, "This is my home. I am not a foreigner. I belong here." As previously noted, these movements had varied effects, both progressive and reactionary, besides failing to achieve their primary goals. Yet failure charted an alternative path in exposing the limits of post-apartheid interventions. Failures and losers in academic worlds can also offer an alternative route to knowledge production, away from, and I quote, market economies and the demand for narrow expertise. And that's from Jack Habestam, writing about queer failure. The failures of this project reveal enduring institutional logics and histories, colonial and neoliberal, which shape the directions, possibilities, and limits of decolonizing initiatives, but also the desires and aspirations, the affective economies that drive them. This account of failure makes visible what is otherwise hidden in narratives of institutional and personal academic success. At the very least, the failures of one South-South research collaboration caution against any simplistic celebration of South-South connections as being intrinsically decolonizing. Failure raises the stakes by showing that universities of the South are not straightforwardly hospitable to decolonial thinking and practice, or that achieving decolonial aspirations here too will not be met without frustration or struggle. It reveals liberatory pedagogies that are feminist and queer to be hospitable to the reproduction rather than the disruption of coloniality, whether out of compulsion or choice. And finally, that the South-South cannot constitute remedy without a material redistribution of the global knowledge economy. Recognizing these tensions and limits is not hard, but charting what is to be done is harder. Nobody said it would be easy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Srila. Let's welcome Maria. You can have
Thank you very much. I both can't see you because of the glare and because of my reduced stature. You would be surprised to hear how many discussions we had about the height of this lectern and whether Srila and I would be visible on the other side of it. Hopefully you can see me, even if I can't quite see all of you. I want to start by saying that it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you today to act as a discussant for this powerful talk. So thank you for the invitation. I've now encountered Srila's ideas both as an article in Sociological Review and as a talk here today, although I had the privilege of getting to read it before you all listened to it. And in each of those intimate encounters, both dissonant and consonant, I found these ideas very inspiring. And so for me, this is a very powerful and a very topical intervention that I believe forces us to question a whole range of taken for granted habits, both epistemic and political, and also a whole range of affects that drive a lot of the work that many of us here in this room and outside do, both under the banner of decolonization and as other forms of critique and intervention in the academy and in the world. Now, in my very short intervention as a discussant, what I want to do is first highlight what for me are the main, most interesting, most powerful contributions, interventions that Srila makes. And then I want to move on to 3 clusters of questions, which hopefully will also resonate with things on your mind, and would resonate with your own experiences of desiring, attempting to, successfully or not, enact different collaborations and different ways of producing knowledge. So for me, Srila's intervention here today and in the article in Sociological Review feel refreshing and feel powerful because they do a few things that, in my reading at least of a lot of contemporary critical scholarship, are not quite done, at least not in these ways. So first, I'm very drawn to Srila's commitment to very explicitly resisting the romanticization of particular locations, of particular people, of particular institutions, of particular communities. And her reminder to all of us that romanticization, even done with the best of intentions and with the most liberatory of impulses, is a flattening exercise, and that flattening has effects that we may want to question. Related to this, Srila resists the tendency, as in my reading of her ideas, she resists the tendency in much critical scholarship to displace power always elsewhere, always in some other region, some other people, some other kinds of writings and forms of knowledge production. And she encourages us to recognize the complexity of power dynamics and also the surprises of our entanglements in these power relations, both avowed and disavowed. For me also, Srila's intervention is very helpful in situating our epistemic and political ambitions, whether those are to decolonize, to produce critical knowledge, to change the world. She situates those within the actual located work of academic knowledge production, inviting us to contextualize those ambitions within the material limitations of that work, limitations of time, of funding, of location, and also within the very messy affective economy of that work, with its desires, its frustrations, its failures. In doing all of these things, the intervention for me has quite a very powerfully broad reach. Yes, Srila's discussion is very much about one South-South collaboration with very particular relationships between Indian and African colleagues at a specific point in space and time. But as I read it and sort of try to connect with my own experiences and my own work and my own sites of encounter, it offers very rich insight and can be very helpful to make sense also of other situations, and there are many, many such situations, where our radical ambitions come face to face with mundane limitations, where the clarity of our desires brush up against the complexity of the issues that we're trying to tackle. Situations where our yearning for intimacy comes face to face with inevitable incommensurabilities. So I think Srila's framework for me is very helpful in making sense of situations in academia, in activism, in all sorts of locations, where we imagine, perhaps we fantasize, that we will work outside forms of power, that we will work among ourselves, whoever the ourselves is, that we will work with others who we imagine, who we hope, will understand us and will give us deep intimacy and full recognition. And then, as we do that work, as we actually encounter these others that we imagine in these romanticized ways, we bump up against difference, frustration, and hierarchies that we did not expect, and that I don't think we always have a very good language to describe. So for me, Srila's talk very beautifully and provocatively articulates the sorts of questions that I find myself asking in those moments. What happens when our epistemic, our political desires become frustrated? What happens when the people, the objects, the places, the relationships, the concepts, the theories, the big name academics, in which we've deposited our hopes of remedy, our hopes of redemption, our hopes of liberation, fail to deliver on their radical promise? And how do we sustain hope when we can't easily find hope in the places or people we were most hopeful about? So I've been trying to use some of these ideas in Srila's work to think through some of these questions myself. So what I want to do now is ask Srila 3 clusters of questions that her talk raises for me. So the first cluster of questions relates to, for me, one of my favorite aspects of the piece, which is Srila's engagement with failure and frustration. As I was reading Srila's work, I was thinking of a talk that I'm involved in the Center for the Study of Women and Gender at the University of Warwick. And around this time last year, we hosted online a lecture by Jennifer Nash and Samantha Pinto, 2 authors based in the US. The recording of that talk is on our website if you're interested to listen to it. And in that talk, Jennifer Nash and Sam Pinto noted that we often see the experience of being frustrated with other feminists as an experience that means that something has gone wrong or that someone is wrong. So what they argue is that we seem to explicitly or implicitly desire feminist interactions that are smooth, that are easy, that are never frustrating. And we sometimes seem to believe, according to them, that it's possible to achieve these frictionless, smooth feminist interactions if we do the work in the right ways and if we work with the right feminists. So Srila, you tell us in your talk that you yourself hoped and imagined that this South-South collaboration would feel attuned, intimate, smooth, emancipatory, radical, but then, of course, many aspects of it failed to deliver this. You argued at the end that achieving decolonial aspirations will not be met without frustration or struggle, and you finished your talk with, for me, a very powerful statement: nobody said it would be easy. And yet we often imagine hope or speak as if it should be easy. Because I was so inspired by your invitation to accept and maybe even work with failure and frustration, my first set of questions is about precisely this. How do you think we should conceptualize the role of failure, disappointment, or frustration in contemporary critical academic work? What do you make of contemporary feminist and decolonial desires to work primarily, maybe only, with ideas, places, and people that will not frustrate us, that will meet our needs, reflect our identities, give us what we seek? And to return to one of the questions I mentioned earlier, how do you think we can sustain hope and belief in the face of disappointment with those solidarities and communities that we had high hopes for? And for me, I want to say it explicitly, this question of sustaining hope and belief in the face of disappointment with solidarities feels like a particularly important one at this point of such significant violence in Palestine. My second cluster of questions is about desire, something that is also very crucial to both the impetus that drove this collaboration and the article that you write about it. As I mentioned at the start, for me, a very particularly inspiring feature of Srila's talk is the invitation to think critically about our passionate investments. Srila mentioned the tendency to romanticize Southern solidarities, to promote a blanket valorization of Southern concepts, to fall for easy celebrations of Southern exchanges, and to see certain forms of work from the South, from the global South, as intrinsically positive, even liberatory. You remind us in your article that these desires for the liberatory potential of Southern work and connection can be powerful catalysts of important epistemic and political action, including the project you describe. But you also note that these desires, and I quote, can elide, even obscure, the frictions, asymmetries, hierarchies, and difference that exist within the South. So this brings me to my second cluster of questions. What place do you think these forms of desire for the radical potential of the global South should have in contemporary critical work? And how do we harness the potential of this desire while remaining alert to the important risks that you have identified? And finally, I want to end where Srila began. You may remember that Srila started by talking about her own experience of positionality. You reflected on the complexities of that position at the start of your talk. And you spoke, I think, in very interesting ways about the desires that others had of you and the expectations that they projected on you when you arrived in South Africa. I suspect we might also reflect about the desires and expectations that we have of you right now. Invite you as a speaker in an annual lecture, what desires and expectations are being projected there too. You said at one point in your article, and I noticed also in the interview that you gave to Sociological Review, you said, I was an ideal native to lead this project. And knowing your work, I suspect you use those terms critically and suspiciously. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this idea of the ideal native, the currency of this idea, and the effects of it. What do you think about contemporary desires for ideal subjects? How do you relate to the positioning of yourself as an ideal native, back in South Africa, but also here? And do we need to rethink our investments in ideal subjects? Now, I know that's a lot of questions and some very thorny ones, and we don't have a lot of time. And also, of course, many of you will have your own questions, so feel free to engage only with some or none of those, if you wish. And thank you so much, Srila, for giving a talk that, for me at least, helps create the conditions for us to ask these difficult questions about the hopes, the desires, and the failures that drive our collective work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. And thanks, Srila. Would you like to respond to Maria's question? And then we can open up to questions from the audience.
Yeah, I mean, like, is this on? Can you hear me? Yes. I mean, like you've said, that's yeah, a lot to think through. But it's also, I think it's nice to open it up, right? And to think, and hopefully that gives the audience a sense that we don't want this conversation really to just be about this paper or this lecture. We want it to be about a cluster of issues, which I think here I've got down as frustration, hope, and desire, which is, you know, could really take that either way. So I suppose I think with frustration and failure, I mean, in a very kind of sort of pragmatic way, it is really to think about the productive possibilities of failure, at least, right? To, you know, think about it in the Habestam terms of, you know, how does queerness open up from failing at femininity or womanhood? So productive is not necessarily being positive, but at least to think about failure as not just being, you know, an end point, but to think about in what different directions that might go. But I suppose in thinking about higher education, I mean, there is a way in which, you know, academics don't really talk about failure, do we? I mean, I feel like it's only been on Twitter that people do those kind of shadow CVs where they talk about all the grant applications they didn't get or something like that. And I do think about in spaces like this, or even earlier when we had a smaller space and a kind of workshop space, what would it mean to talk about things that we haven't been successful at, right? And and not just in terms of a pedagogical, like learning to do better exercise, but obviously what that reveals about systemic issues, you know, about systemic exclusions or limits, or, you know, what the institution sort of, or particular academic systems, kind of ecosystems expect of us, and how we can't quite deliver that, and we are constantly sort of trying and hitting against walls. So anyway, so that's, I suppose, one way of thinking about failure. I think I'm really interested in your questions around ideal natives and ideal subjects and ideal sites, also because, and just for many of you who may not know, and Wes talked about it mentioned it in the introduction, I wrote a book which came out last year, which is about feminist and queer politics in contemporary India, sort of globalized India. And a lot of that is about investments in ideal subjects, really, like what the ideal subject of feminism. And it's really, the book tries to theorize contemporary, both queer and non-queer feminist formations as sort of being haunted by these normativities, haunted by this idea of what is an ideal subject of feminist politics, you know, and often in the post-colonial context, and not just in India, but specifically to India, you know, if you ask someone who is the Indian woman, the answer would be she's in the villages, she's poor, right? And what does it then mean for politics to be deeply invested in speaking on behalf of the rural, the poor, the underprivileged? And the book sort of shows, you know, what those modalities and what those forms of haunting produce in the contemporary moment. And often they do produce forms of inequality and paternalism and so on and so forth. But I think more broadly, I think it's really striking, even in this moment, or in an earlier moment with you know, the war in Ukraine, for instance, how radical politics is so invested in ideal spaces and subjects and sites, right? How you know, it's still the case. I find it very peculiar how, particularly from being on the African continent, how people located, our anti-imperialist voices in the US can uphold China as a kind of progressive liberatory force. So anyway, I mean, that's besides the point, what we think of, you know, geopolitics. But it is interesting how radical politics and radical theory is deeply invested in having an ideal subject. So if I think of subaltern studies and the way, and its attachments to the figure of the peasant, right? Or again, feminist politics. And I think Sam and Jen's work has been really powerful in trying to sort of at least deconstruct that for us and think of what these attachments and investments are about, right? What they reveal about us as particular epistemic or political communities. So yeah, I think that is, I'm really interested in that question about ideal subjects. And of course, the ideal, I mean, it's interesting, I suppose why I'm talking about myself as an ideal native in South Africa is because the native informant would make more sense in the northern context, right? I mean, for a lot of us, who like me, came here to the heart of, empire to do graduate studies, I feel like I was always already oriented towards coming here. It was already very much in my horizon of aspiration and even expectation, like to get a scholarship and to come to England and do postgraduate work, right? So the arrival here didn't feel at all dissonant. And then to become a native informant, to be asked, oh, how do you speak such good English? Or, tell us about something about India. But I think I use it deliberately in the South African context because that's where you don't expect it, right? You suddenly, like, to evoke Kusakani, you're amongst your own, among ourselves. And that's what I want to sort of explore and think a little bit more deeply about. What produces the among ourselves? Because actually, there's nothing to suggest that I wouldn't be completely outside and not belong in South Africa. Why would I? Do you know what I mean? I mean, I would be a migrant there as I am anywhere else. But I think this is the foil that we are, the other to the West, that we presume outside of the West, especially in other post-colonial contexts. In other contexts with people of color, we would seamlessly belong, and we would immediately have a kind of community to enter and belong to. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to, not sort of disabuse myself of that idea like some kind of fantasy, but because some things are easier and some things are more difficult. But I think to try and think about, well, what is it? What produces that? And I suppose it is a colonial logic of who is the self and who is the other. And then, what those lines of belonging and exclusion. And just, I don't know, I don't think that answers anything, but anyway. But just very finally on hope. Yeah, I don't know, it's such a difficult one, isn't it? And actually, I was thinking about that when I was thinking of your response, and I just thought, Arundhati Roy, I think, says it really well, where she says, hope or no, I think it's hope or no hope, this is what we do. It's sort of like, this is just what you've got to do. And it's really been striking to me to see the protest actions happening every weekend here in the face of relentless, relentless, unceasing political carnage, and still people are on the street. And I think that really embodies this kind of, well, this is what you've just got to do, and what else is there to do, I suppose. I think we should be, do you want to say something?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we welcome questions and comments from the audience. William will hand over the mic, and please raise your hand up. Thank you. We've got lots of questions. Thanks.
Hello, my name's Roxanne. I teach at Goldsmiths, and I'm not here for that. I'm here to very much enjoy myself on a Friday night, and you've delivered that, so thank you very much. Amongst people who are clearly gathered to do the same thing. The thing that really struck me was the discussions of failure and the costs of failure, basically who pays the struggle and the frustration. It's my own research focus, actually, is in failure, so, but I'm really fascinated to hear your insights into who pays the costs of the failure, the cost of the struggle. Seems to me to be very unbalanced.
Should we collect a few more questions, and then we can ask Srila and Maria to respond? Yes.
Thank you very much. Ooh, loud. Hi, I'm Ilaria. I'm a PhD student at Cambridge. I thank you very much for this talk. Very exciting to be here. My question is around the site, talking about sites and places, and because you started talking about transnational feminisms and you concluded talking about sort of the role of civil social movements, sorry, social movements in decolonization. I would love to hear your thoughts about stepping outside of academia as the producers of decolonial knowledge and feminist theory, feminist theory from the South, and whether you have any thoughts or reflections on the role of other forms of feminist spaces, knowledge production. I'm thinking and the potential of the South-South collaborations there with all of the tensions that you've spoken about in an academic setting, but I'm thinking, for example, of Batiwala's work on feminist leadership and how much that's circulating in this moment across feminist movements in South Asia, in Africa, and across, and what is the potential of that, and how can we think with that in efforts to decolonize the higher education.
Thank you. Should we respond to the two questions?
Should we take one more?
Okay.
Hi, this is Anandi from SOAS, and I had a question about, I guess, language and the neoliberal infrastructure, if English is the language of knowledge production, I suppose. Yeah. Then in an Indian context, I guess that privileges certain caste and class positionalities. And I'm assuming similar class positionalities perhaps in East Africa or South Africa. I guess how, was the failure, not without romanticizing other languages, was a certain failure inevitable if it's going to be in English? I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Sorry, could you just repeat the last bit?
If the failure was
About language.
inevitable, if it was conceptualized in English. I don't know, if that's makes sense.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello, Srila. Thank you so much for your talk. I really find it very insightful. So I'm Harshul, based in SOAS, and I'm a Dalit student. And I build on that while I state my question. And I want to bring in about the aspect of epistemic infrastructure. So while we talk about Global South, it's in fact that we ourselves have many hegemonies, which goes vertical and horizontal. How do we address these hegemonic or dominant things of caste, class, and our ascribed privileges? And particularly when we are talking about decolonizing, are we extended towards de-Brahmanization? And in doing so, who gets to ride and who gets to be involved in this process? So, and again, we do have South-South collaboration, links, and solidarity. Are we there to build upon South-South critique for ourselves among our own hegemonies, among our own boundaried spaces? So yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah? Yes. Okay, is it okay if I go and then, yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'll start with your question. And I mean, I think as far as I'm understanding, you're talking about internal hierarchies, such as caste, for instance. Yes, exactly. And in the longer piece, I raised the question about, which will be familiar to those of us from the Indian context, on how private universities, liberal arts, those modeled on liberal arts colleges are actually charging enormous fees in India. And therefore, their caste composition is almost, one of the statistics I read was 80% upper caste, right? So one of the questions I raise in the longer piece is about how hospitable these institutions are to those who might be marginalized by caste in their own midst, right? And there was a quote that I used by someone in a media story who says, there's always Black Lives Matter protests on these campuses, but never against caste politics or never anti-caste politics. So So I think that's also really important to, and of course a lot of people are talking about it, to bring into the decolonizing discussion and debate, particularly in the North, that it's not about let's include an Indian, but it's about who from the subcontinent, for instance, right? In an understanding, in acknowledging the power differentials in that locale, right? So that's and I say this as part of, expanding the decolonizing conversation. So to understand how caste operates, or casteism like racial capitalism, for instance, right? And therefore to think about, I think Priya Gopal actually makes the argument in an interview or in a piece, and I sat there in the bigger piece. About language, I don't think language, I haven't really thought about that, but I don't think language was really what this hinged on. But I will say that in my institution, after the student movements, there are now a lot more opportunities and, for staff and student, but staff as well, to learn African languages. And I wonder if that happens in India, for instance, in the same way, where it's really made, I think now they're really making it attractive for people to study, but I think soon it's going to be sort of compulsory. And I do think that's a good thing, particularly in a settler colonial context like South Africa, where, white settlers can't pronounce African names and can't speak Zulu at all, right? So I do think that it would actually, to have a language policy in that context would make a huge difference. Social movements and other forms of feminist knowledge production. Did you mean outside of movements as well? Because I can think of a lot of, organizations who are doing really interesting transnational work. So for instance, one of the things that my project actually did, which took on a life of its own, was to get archives, so queer archives on the continent, quite few, like one in Angola, one in Mozambique, and South Africa, to interact and collaborate. And that's also really interesting because it's sort of Lusophone Africa, Anglophone Africa, and then so language translation, all of that comes in. Also, in most parts of the continent, sexuality is still criminalized, and obviously that's really being retched up in the current moment, right? So then how do you get, so how do you produce knowledge? How do you archive? How do you document everyday lives which are being, lived under risk and so on? And Danielle, who's in the audience, has also been part of some of these projects. So there are different, those are kind of, I think they blur the boundaries between academic, organizing, activist, because they're sort of different people who are pooling resources to do, properly interesting kind of transnational knowledge production, right? But I also think of movements, to go back to like the caste example of like Dalit activists, having long histories of solidarity with anti-racist activists, black activists in the US. Also in the light of Fees Must Fall, again, those kind of unexpected links between, different sites. So I think there's lots going on which is sort of outside of the university. But I think also what some of you will know from other contexts that you come from, that in places like, at least in my experience, South Africa and India, the university is not so ivory tower. Its borders are a lot more porous. It's not as professionalized as it is here, where, what happens outside is completely outside. So there are a lot of people in universities who are in touch with, and doing work with communities, resistant communities outside. So I don't know if that makes sense. And about, finally, who pays for the costs of failure? That's an interesting question. I think in terms of my little example, you could say that failure is actually a great way of snubbing the donor. To actually do a report that said nothing happened. We produced nothing. We published nothing. And you know what? That I felt very much I had nothing to lose because, and this is also very much part of, I think, what we're talking about here, Northern hegemony,
the funder, who was an American funder, funded very major projects, including institutional sites like 2 robust research centers in South Africa alone, much less elsewhere in the continent, a little bit in Lebanon, and then decided on a whim that they would no longer fund the African continent. They would reorient towards the US because the humanities in the US needed more resources, which is fine. But guess what that meant? That meant actually, I didn't care. I didn't have to deliver anything because they were gone. So on the one hand, that shows the whims of donors, right? It shows that from one day to the next, you can decide this entire region is no longer our priority, even though people's salaries are dependent on you. But on the other hand, it means that actually for obviously small fry like me in this whole thing, the stakes really changed.
Thank you. Have we got more questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk and the response. I've learnt so much. My name's Alice, and I look at these issues in relation to the politics of libraries. And I'm wondering if in your study, you in any of the partners you work with, if you engaged with librarians or archivists in your conversations and observations. And the reason I ask that is, I think work on the politics of knowledge production, it tends to get focused on like the production part, the modes and the products of epistemic cultures and habits, etc. And often the focus on how knowledge is ordered, mediated or accessed gets less attention. So I'm wondering, as I said, how, if that's come up at all, because the way in which libraries are structured and completely embedded in what a university is are conditioned by colonial logics. So yeah, I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that and if it had come up in your work at all.
Thank you. We got another question from...
Thank you, Srila, and really inspiring and thought-provoking lecture. And thank you, Maria, for raising the idea of hope. Actually, when I listening to the failure between the South-South collaboration, I'm thinking about the idea raised by Anjali and Geeta, and they are thinking that by pairing queerness and Asianness, we should think through and wire the impossibility. And I just wonder, how would you respond or think about the possibility and impossibility in the South-South collaboration? And if you remember, in the Queer Asia as a Method conference 2 years ago, and Geeta just very astutely raised the idea of shayad, poetics and politics. So shayad in Urdu and Hindi means perhaps, maybe. So the shayad, poetics and politics may be like an alternative method for the South-South collaboration. I just wonder how you respond to this. Thanks.
So nice.
Thank you. We got another one from the front. Yes.
Thanks, Srila. That was really great to listen to. I'm Daniel. I'm one of the people who runs Queer Asia. And I just heard Liang's question on Queer Asia as well. So I was just interested to know a little bit more about, this desire to do global South-South collaborations. I think coming from a place of having written about Queer Asia as failure, drawing from that 6, 7, 8 years of that project, it's not, it's not funded in any way. It's just a labor of love, and maybe a foolish labor of love, I don't know. Where does this desire come from, and how, I guess almost it's a cultural question, and how have we somehow managed to internalize it when people in the global north, pardon my French, don't give a shit about that? So I guess that's, I liked that you said that there was this desire, and I was just, do you have more reflections on where this desire came from?
Thank you. Question from the front, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. My name's Carol Ann Dixon. I'm a cultural geographer. I was really interested in what you were talking about with regard to blackness as an afterthought when you cited Macharia and the frictions of intimacy across the black diaspora. And I just wondered if you could just unpack how that manifested itself. You spoke about the Indian side of the research study and the collaboration that was strongly orientated towards the USA and focused on the scholarship of white queer theorists. But were there any other instances where that blackness as an afterthought played out? Thank you.
Thank you.
Maria, do you want to have a go? Okay, I'll start with the last question again. Thank you. Thank you for all the questions. So, Macharia doesn't, it's actually an article in GLQ. It's a great special issue. Some of you will know it in GLQ on, queer area studies, or arguing against thinking beyond the concept of area studies. And that's where Macharia's contribution is. And he doesn't say very much more. I mean, he doesn't say much more about what he means by blackness constituting an afterthought, except for that quotation, which is about the names and how, the names seem alien to US queer theory. And then he says, it's a very cheeky piece, like I think a lot of his writing, which is very beautiful and provocative, says, I've also decided, therefore, to, very intentionally populate my writing with names they can't pronounce, or something like that. But I think what was interesting in my own encounter with, or experience with this particular research center was that, it was an online, like a webinar series. So the first year, like I said, or I described, they had, some really major figures, and then they had like a theorist based in the US and someone based in India. But they ran it for the second year of COVID too, and then it was much more expansive. But what that meant was that there were African Americans. And that was really striking and interesting to me, how then a way of kind of including blackness, if we're using Macharia's language, is through the African American or African American theorizing, so Afro-pessimism, decolonial thought, and so on and so forth. And that's really, it's quite interesting to me, and I'll just, deviate for a second and talk about, so part of this book that I'm writing is each chapter is on something different. So this is on collaboration, one is on teaching, one is on publishing, and so on and so forth. But the teaching one, I begin with the vignette where I got called out, so I teach a feminist theory postgraduate class, and I got called out for having too many African Americans in my syllabus and not enough Africans. And this was quite early, and it was during the student movement, and I reacted very defensively. But later on, I just thought that's actually so useful, because obviously and again, it's one of those things, right? How we tend to actually just think of, how here, for instance, in the North, I often see people are talking about decolonizing by having people of color from within that context. But that obviously completely, gets rid of the problem of having someone from elsewhere who needs a visa, who has limited mobility, blah, blah, blah. But it's not the same. And actually, in retrospect, I was very grateful for that student to say, having bell hooks is not like the same as having Sylvia Tamale. Obviously, why would it be? You know what I mean? And again, I think this goes back to that question of desire and, and even with our syllabus, what we are imagining that syllabus to be doing, and how we think certain emancipatory pedagogies will land the same way everywhere. But why would they? Do you know what I mean? Like, why would you assume that bell hooks would just, like your African students would be like, woohoo, bell hooks? Especially when there's like a huge production currently of literature by local feminist scholars, a huge production. Why wouldn't you have that on your syllabus, right? But anyway, I mean, that's a broader conversation, and it just, But, I don't know if that, anyway, okay. Moving along, so, I should have written them all down. I thought I was complete, it was all in my head. Daniel. So by the way, just to go back to what you had asked for. So folks like Daniel and also other people I know like Hall, I don't know if you know the journal, have been doing these amazing, again, completely voluntary, right? Like amazing sources of knowledge production, archiving, which are entirely open access. And we do have to ask ourselves why we actually, for those of us who are teachers, don't cite more of that kind of work on our syllabus. I mean, like, it's still on, isn't it? Or the Queer Asia, the website, it was a whole range of, yeah, it was a lot of material actually.
No, I was just, yeah, we're still doing some stuff. But the collaboration with Kohol was really incredible. So that in that journal with Kohol, and you were there when you joined us virtually during the pandemic. That's the piece that I'd written on queer Asia as failure, and we were trying a curatorial strategy to work against what we recognized as, people self-selecting inside of area ghettos or nationalist politics, sort of internalizing that. But I mean, the question that I was kind of asking is like, where does this desire to do this South-South work come from? Because before I recognized the desire, I was already doing that work. And,
Same, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I could ask you, where do you think it's coming from? I think it's also partly, I mean, in my case, and that's what I sort of opened with, to recognize that it was also instrumental. In retrospect, I think it was the easiest way for me to establish myself in a completely different context by saying, oh, I can do India, South Africa. I can do, again, that's part of our colonial inheritance. I can do comparative work. I can bring two rape cultures of the world together and see what, analysis of GBV produce. And that was the first thing I got research funding for, very small-scale project. But so I think I don't think we should, I mean, certainly, maybe I should just speak for myself, like what is easily commoditized in a marketplace of ideas, right? And even if like the stakes are much smaller in the South African context, I mean, now there's no funding for the humanities, basically. The stakes are higher here. But at least it enables you to speak to local communities or local epistemic trends or something, right? So the minute I could say, I'm talking about GBV, I could interact with other scholars because GBV is such a big, everyday issue, but also a site for research. So yeah, so I think on the one side, what I'm trying to say is that I think desires are instrumental, even if unacknowledged. But on the other hand, I think maybe it is something about, post-colonial subjectivities, and certainly I feel like that is what led me to think, led me to assume easy Afro-Asian intimacies, to think that obviously as post-colonial subjects, there's something that we share. And therefore there's something, maybe we will mirror each other in some way. Maybe we will reflect each other's needs or each other's desires, right? And I think that's what everyone wants. Everyone wants a bit of a mirror, right? So, yeah, you want someone to reflect something of your own. And I think a lot of us who are maybe in northern spaces don't have that very easily. We don't have something that reflects who we are, or maybe we don't want to see that reflection. And I don't know, yeah. Was there anything else? No. Go ahead. Oh, did I have a... oh, yes, there were questions on, that's right, archives and libraries, and on Croatia's method. I think on all I would say about accessing knowledge, I mean, in both South Africa and India, it's really shadow archives. It's LibGen. There's really nothing else. That if Skyhub and LibGen goes, that's going to be the end of many of our access to to knowledge, because the idea of having a material object as a book, which takes so much time to get to you, is so expensive, or even to your library, etc. So the easiest way is to access a shadow archive. So I don't know if that, I mean, because you were asking about access to, how knowledge is ordered, mediated, accessed, or was that someone else?
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, it was that. I was maybe not phrasing it very well, but I'm thinking about with calls to decolonize and the movements to decolonize universities, what role do or might libraries play in that?
Oh,
or librarians and archivists. So
yes.
Either in continuing to reproduce the colonial logics of how of access to knowledge and hierarchies of knowledge, or I was wondering if you'd spoken to any librarians or archivists who may be trying to engage in those struggles.
Yeah. I haven't, I don't know personally librarians and how they're curating collections, but I do know some archivists, but again, I wouldn't say it's representative. I mean, the people I know who work in archives are working in queer archives and are doing very radical and counter-hegemonic work. Interestingly, they're getting quite a lot of funding for it, and that's again, I think, how this terrain can be so messy because sexuality is now so hot on the African continent. There's a lot of funding being pumped for it, because sexuality is under threat. So again, one can look at that as a huge possibility, but then one has to think, well, what's going to happen a few years later? To be aware of how changing fads of funding and what's considered urgent is constantly moving, right? So it might have been HIV/AIDS, it might be sexuality now, it'll be something else. And but again, and maybe that's the hope question, people do what they do. And I think it's really good that people take the funding that's available, because you can't really make a lot of choices or reject what's there. Why not? You do what you can do at that moment. Okay, Shayad. So, it was very nice. I don't really have anything to say, except were you saying that Geeta Patel uses it as a probability, possibility, something tentative?
Yeah, actually, I think Geeta framed the Shayad as both politics and politics. So the politics and politics may bring it as an alternative after the failure of the South-South collaboration. Maybe can be the alternative.
Yeah, no, that's very nice. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your engagement, your participation in this discussion. And thanks very much for Srila and Maria for this fantastic talk, and very insightful, and a lot of takeaway points to reflect on, and hope we can continue to engage with this topic. For example, issue around desire and positionality, contemporary ideal subjects, but also the issue about failure and success. And I'm just wondering that perhaps we can talk to your your collaborators. Do they feel the same about failure? But thanks very much for your talk, and thanks very much, Maria.